Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be a part of this panel. And I want to apologize ahead of time if anyone really hates presentations. Sorry. So the title of my talk today is Treating Difference, Race, Risk, and the Politics of HIV and AIDS Prevention. As Dr. Richardson said, my name is Thurka Sangaramoorthy, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'm a medical anthropologist, and I work mostly in applied public health. And what that means is that I focus on three major things. First, a lot of my work is people-focused. It's a focus on understanding local knowledge and perspectives to improve health outcomes. And I feel very strongly that this provides an important practical corrective to health interventions that are often planned without any consideration of local realities. I also focus on structural determinants. Really, what that means is focusing on the impact of poverty and social inequality on health. And also importantly, I study relationships of power and power relations that are already embedded in health institutions, among health experts, and particularly around disciplinary and professional logic. So meaning that I don't just study the culture of individuals and communities, but also the culture of physicians, for instance, the culture of major donors that contribute to health. So my talk focuses really on HIV/AIDS in the United States, and I just want to give a brief overview for those who might not be as aware of the conditions in this country. We've had roughly about 2 million people that have been infected with HIV since the very beginning of the epidemic. HIV disproportionately impacts certain groups, and the way that we sort of stratify these groups first is by risk factors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. By risk factor, it's really what we call MSM, or men who have sex with men. We also say that HIV disproportionately impacts by race and ethnicity, and primarily and overwhelmingly among Black communities. And the one thing that people might not know, or might not be as familiar, is the South is really the epicenter of AIDS. It's not in large cities like Miami or Atlanta. It's actually much more in rural areas and smaller cities like Baton Rouge and Jackson, Mississippi, for instance. And the South has the greatest number of people estimated to be living with AIDS, to be dying of AIDS, and of all new HIV diagnoses as well. And one of these states is Florida, and HIV and AIDS has had a real impact in Florida. And Florida kind of wavers between second and third among states in terms of people living with HIV and AIDS. And Blacks and African Americans in particular are disproportionately impacted like they are in the rest of the country. Over half of all those living with AIDS come under this category of Black or African American. Almost half of new cases. HIV/AIDS was the leading cause of death from the very beginning of the epidemic up until 2010 for Black men and women, and it recently sort of fell only in 2011. Oh, sorry. And what I wanted to show here is that Florida is one of the only states that actually stratifies what this category of Black actually might mean. And one way that they do this is by country of birth. And this is just to show you, this is for the case in Miami-Dade County where I worked, but this is to show you that a large percentage of this are those who were born in Haiti. And these numbers are very contested, and we can have a much longer conversation of why a state like Florida might actually want this type of information. For those of you who don't know, Haitians have had a long history in terms of their relationships with HIV/AIDS in this country. They were considered one of the original 4 age groups designated by public institutions and scientists in this country as having high risk. They were stigmatized. Haitians very much to this day are still associated with HIV and AIDS and still seen as unclean and diseased. There's been a lot of fear for over 35 years, along with political and economic marginalization and immigration status that really impact the way that they interact with HIV programs and this juggernaut that is HIV/AIDS in Florida and Miami in particular. So based on all of this, about 10 years of research have gone into this book called Treating AIDS, Politics of Difference, a Paradox of Prevention. And the three major questions that I really ask in this book and in my research is, through what mechanisms do fundamental social, economic, and political structures lead, how do they lead to health disparities? Through what mechanisms do HIV/AIDS prevention programs actually naturalize social and health inequalities? And how does HIV/AIDS prevention work in the Haitian community and much broader community of this category of Blacks and African Americans in Florida, given this long history of discrimination and distrust? So I want to just very briefly talk to you about some of the findings. In answering these questions, first of all, there is a very specific racial and ethnic hierarchy in Miami. Miami has the highest percentage of foreign-born residents of any area in the United States. Waves of new immigrants, Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, coming from countries with various political and economic conflict, have really fashioned this sort of turbulent ethnic kaleidoscope. And because of immigration patterns and national foreign policy, Cuban Americans have forced a reverse acculturation, a Latinization, by substantially controlling socioeconomic, symbolic, and political power. Haitians fall almost on the very bottom here. And their integration into Miami is very different from other groups because of US policies towards Haitian refugees and unavailability of unskilled jobs where they face severe marginalization. And there's a lot of normalization, a routine discrimination that occurs among Haitians. Second, social structure produces HIV/AIDS disparities through living and working conditions. So things like poverty, unemployment, legal status, stigma, severe racial discrimination, all sort of combine to produce the inequalities in health that are very specific to HIV/AIDS in a place like Miami, and actually throughout the United States. A major component of my work, sorry, allergies, is that HIV/AIDS pathology is very much linked to identity. And what this does is that it reinforces these notions of difference, and race and ethnicity, what I argue, have become really proxy risk factors for HIV and AIDS. And what I'm trying to say is that HIV prevention is very much rooted in risk assessment. We all know what the risk factors for AIDS are. They're posters, they're interventions, but the fact is that risk is highly ambiguous. Risk is the complex context in which exposure to HIV occurs. It's the transmission route itself. Risk is actually the behavior which increases an individual's chances of contracting AIDS, but it's also the groups of individuals who are seen as at risk or risky. What I'm arguing is that this ambiguity doesn't make it go away. It actually increases its potency. Grouping individuals based on a characteristic behavior that could lead to transmission risk and moving fluidly between groups of people, context, exposure, and behavior actually naturalizes very easily the connections between disease, behavior, and groups of people. These categories don't allow us to think of these groups as being diverse in terms of regularity and frequency of engaging in risky sexual practices. They also don't reflect the social context through which a person becomes susceptible to HIV transmission. Racial and ethnic stereotyping often accompanies this type of allocation of segments of the population into risk groups. So notions of race, ethnicity, and culture become inherently characteristics of disease and disparities in health. Another way to think about this is that case-based surveillance and epidemiology are used to identify individual risk. And then these individuals are lumped together on the basis of this risk. Some groups center around behavioral characteristics associated with high risk, such as men who have sex with men or intravenous drug users. Other groups, like Blacks or Haitians or women, are socially defined based on race, ethnicity, gender, and nationality. These characteristics that define these groups are conceptualized as very distinct categories, and the groups themselves become conceptually very flattened to seem as they were naturally occurring categories of difference, even though they have varying logics, histories, and meanings. These behaviorally and socially constructed categories that reflect individual calculations of risk stand in for culturally distinct communities with a shared history, social ties, practices, values, and beliefs that put them collectively at risk. So these become the new communities in which we act, right? These are risk communities. What I'm arguing is that politically and socially defined differences are mapped directly onto the differences that are the products of biomedical research. This is what I'm saying is that it has the effect of naturalizing risk as behaviorally, biologically, and culturally mediated. So what are the consequences of this in these communities? AIDS prevention has very unintended outcomes in Haitian communities and other communities of color. AIDS still represents a continuing legacy of unequal citizenship, power, and privilege based on the very notions of racial hygiene and biomedical and social primitivism. Many, as a result, don't actually even engage with prevention programming or with medical establishments altogether because of this long history. Others see AIDS as a way to garner social and medical services because they can't get any type of services otherwise. Others avoid the medical system in the US altogether to get services either through traditional methods or just go to Haiti to obtain healing services. And so, what is to be done? I advocate for an unpacking of the use of race, ethnicity, and culture in clinical and public health settings. I think we need to ask questions like risk groups are useful for whom to do what. We need to examine the social context of risk instead of focusing solely on behavior that then leads us to make these sort of connections very naturally between behavior, race, and ethnicity. I also think that we need to recognize the heterogeneity among Black communities and to plan much more structurally focused interventions focusing on building economic, social, and political empowerment. And then also in terms of incorporating concerns around stigma, discrimination, and distrust also will play a pivotal part in actually re-engaging with these communities. Thank you.